This paper, adapted from my master's thesis, explores ways of hearing formal organization at various levels in the album Parallax 2 Future Sequence by the progressive metal band Between the Buried and Me. The concept album's 72 minutes of densely packed, highly varied musical material offer an opportunity for a rich discussion of the ways in which progressive metal can invite listeners to hear musical form across long spans of time, lead to development of new theoretical concepts, and provide context for rethinking and expanding existing theories of musical organization. While there are several ways in which this is the case, such as through the narrative presented in the music and paraphonography or discussing the album's pervasive genre mixing, I focus here on motivic and sectional returns, which I use as a blanket term for any reuse of previously heard material, from repetition within the same song section to reprises across the length of the entire album with or without changes to the original material. My approach is distinct from recent Formenlayer-inspired understandings of form in metal, such as those by Stephen Hudson and Michael Dekovich. Instead of seeking to understand every part of a track in relation to a formal function and song form, I zoom in on specific types of moments, specifically moments that come back in some way, and discuss how they do so and what roles they might play. My reasons for this cherry-picking approach to form are twofold. First, and most importantly, I believe this reflects how fans hear. These moments of recurrence are central to the process of making sense of the album's long songs, in my own experience and from what I can tell of many fans' interactions with the band's music. Along these lines, I also take a somewhat idiosyncratic understanding of formal function, which I take both in the traditional sense of playing a role within certain musical logic, and in a more literal sense of allowing certain types of interactions from listeners. Second, Between the Buried and Me's songs rarely resemble, or even seem to be derived from, the compound AABA forms discussed by Hudson and Dekovich. I will discuss some of the band's idiosyncratic song-like forms in a moment, but focusing on a few perceptual footholds, so these repeating sections and motives, is thus also pragmatic given the unusual abundance of material found in a typical Between the Buried and Me song. While I focus on the rich and perhaps unusually complex use of these techniques in just this album, I believe that much of what I talk about here is applicable to a wider corpus of progressive music. This paper will have 4 sections. The first 2 will focus on the nature and function of perhaps the most striking types of returns in Parallax 2, which are motivic and sectional returns at the level of the song and at the level of the album. The third and fourth sections of this paper will zero in on some patterns that show up in how motives are reused and structured at more local levels, introducing the concepts of static and variable part riff constructions and what I call the principle of expanding return. The most readily apparent uses of returns in Parallax 2 are the sectional returns at the end of every longer song, which come after many intervening riffs. Glenn Pillsbury proposes the term modular to describe form in Metallica's music, much of which is made up of, quote, independent riffs strung together into largely 4 square sections, end quote. Brad Osborne means essentially the same thing when he describes typical metal structures as one-part polythematic through composed designs. This can be contrasted with his observation that progressive rock songs and albums, quote, often end with explicit recapitulations, end quote. Between the Buried and Me's typical forms exaggerate both the modular nature of metal songs and the recapitulatory nature of progressive rock songs. Their songs not only cycle through a large number of modular riff sections, but they are also saturated with motivic returns across various timescales. Both Stephen Hudson and Michael Dekovich have very recently argued for the importance of compound AABA forms and their extensions in understanding song structure in rock and metal. While the longer songs on Parallax 2 share with some of the more extended compound AABA forms the feeling of triumphant return of familiar material after a long stretch of contrasting material, other aspects in Between the Buried and Me's music are different enough from compound AABA forms that I don't find the label very useful here. I find the other typical label for this type of construction, ternary form, to be unhelpfully vague, because there are often sections before and or after the returning sections, the material that returns is often altered in some way, and there are typically several layers of returning material within the song other than its bookends in the longer songs in Parallax 2. I call Between the Buried and Me's particular brand of modular episodic song-length section return forms Odyssey forms. Like Odysseus, the listener leaves home, experiences a long series of heterogeneous episodes, and eventually makes their way back to a home that is often changed. These forms can be distinguished from more typical metal forms by their long-term section returns, and from more typical progressive rock songs by the modularity, the complexity, and the sheer number of intervening sections. These section-level returns are easy to hear and contribute in a relatively obvious way to hearing form, providing pillars and long-term goals in listening. It's easy to get lost in these songs, which range from 5 minutes to more than 15 minutes in length. Returning to memorable material from early in the song at its end provides a neat way of signposting and providing shape to an otherwise bewildering barrage of material, especially for less familiar listeners. The metaphor of song as journey is a commonplace in music criticism about progressive rock and metal. Song-length section returns also function, in my interpretation, to engender this feeling by providing an indication that the listener has not only gone somewhere, but returned to where they started. Examples of motivic returns that span multiple songs, such as this short one between Astral Body and Extremophile Elite, are usually not as obvious to hear. The most exciting group of these is in the album's final long track, Silent Flight Parliament, which brings back at least one moment in some way from all of the preceding songs. In the interest of time, I'll play one straightforward example now and discuss another in the last section of this paper. Here's a brief section from Astral Body, which returns nearly an hour later on the album with a different vocal melody as a section early in Silent Flight Parliament. Parallax 2 even has one section return that transcends the boundary of the album. This section of Extremophile Elite is a return of a moment from the earlier Parallax 1 EP.
Walking into a certain state of walking into a certain state of walking into a certain state of walking into.
This example of a motivic return that reaches out of the bounds of a single album is rare, and I bring it up not to attribute special structural significance to it, but to gesture towards the ubiquity of motivic returns of many different types on this album. These album-length returns are highly fragmentary and non-rotational, by which I mean that motives return in a way that does not reflect the order in which they originally appeared. This makes many of them difficult to hear. I recognized most of them myself only after playing much of the album on guitar. It seems that, unlike the overt structuring role that song-length section returns play, many of these album-length motivic returns function as Easter eggs, subtle details that reward very close attention. So far, my goal has been to simply introduce the subject of motivic and sectional return in Parallax 2 by pointing out some obvious, so the song-length section returns, and less obvious, so the album-length section returns with variations, examples. In the next two sections of this paper, I'll present more detailed analytical frameworks to highlight consistencies in the way that motivic returns tend to occur, which in turn leads to an argument for their syntactical properties. Gregory McCandless uses the term ABAC, additive metrical process, to describe constructions, ubiquitous in technical and progressive metal subgenres, in which a riff with motivic structure A, B, A, C, or often A prime, A double prime, has metric cardinalities A less than B and B less than C. He shows that this principle can be heard throughout Dream Theater's music, and there are numerous examples in metal across many subgenres. In this and the next section, I propose two generalizations of McCandless's ABAC additive metrical process with relevance for Parallax 2. My first contribution is to propose the concept of rotational static variable constructions, which are a generalization of the ABAC additive metrical process. In static variable constructions, we hear rotations through material in which the beginning is the same in each iteration, so that's the static component, but the endings are different, so that's the variable component. This shifts the focus from meter to motive and form. Meter can still be a fascinating part of the discussion, and many of Between the Buried and Me's static variable constructions are also ABAC additive metrical processes. However, I argue that focusing more on motive and less on meter allows a more convincing look at longer-term organization by sidestepping questions about the aptness of discussing meter across extended time frames and focusing instead on more immediately recognizable motivic returns. Here's an excerpt from Extremophile Elite that provides a clear example of a static variable construction. While it's also a clear example of an ABAC additive metrical process, this doesn't tell the whole story. It's also made up of static and variable parts, riff segments that themselves never change but are combined in various ways. Here's a more complex example from Astral Body, which has 6 separate riff segment atoms, which lead to a more elaborate set of static and variable parts. The metaphor of a cycle through static and variable parts of a riff resonates with the concept of rotation explored by James Hepakoski and Warren Darcy. An alternative metaphor, more immediately in line with this music and with my own experiences of it, is that of the familiar acting as a springboard into the different. In listening, I follow a well-worn path, so the static repeated material, to a fork, and I take a different option in this fork each time, so a different part of the variable material. Static variable constructions can also form the beginnings of a syntactical listening experience for this music, which can occur in addition to the more standard tonal and rock harmonic syntax that's also everywhere in this music. Listening for static and variable parts involves expectation. Upon hearing the return of a familiar riff segment, I know that it's fairly likely that it will end differently than it did before. Exactly how this happens and to what extent it conforms to more specific expectations can become part of the listening experience and allow a stylistically competent listener insights into how a section or song might play out, even if they don't have a detailed veridical familiarity with the song. While the predictive power of these structures is not nearly as sharp as it is in tonal processes, so here I expect to hear a different and longer ending, as opposed to I expect to hear a root position C major triad with C in the upper voice on this exact B. Nevertheless, the potential for play with expectations is no less. Listeners expecting a straightforward ABAC additive metrical process or basic static variable parts construction in the section from Astral Body that I played a moment ago for example, might be led on a long and intricate commentary on this construction, which unfolds by repeatedly revealing larger levels of structure. Describing expectations in the form of static variable constructions formalizes my intuition that progressive metal gives rise to syntactical effects for stylistically competent listeners by means entirely independent from harmony. My second addition to McCandless's ABAC additive metrical process concept is to propose an abstract cousin to it, which I call expanding return. Put simply, returning material in Parallax 2 tends to be presented in an extended or expanded form. This section of Layer Ghosts to Rest presents a crystallized, localized version of expanding return. This riff is an unambiguous static variable construction, which is also an ABAC additive metrical process. However, what is striking about this riff is that instead of introducing new, longer variable parts, the variable part is simply repeated more times on each cycle, creating the pattern A, B, A, B, B, A, B, 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 B. While no other riff sections on the album are structured in exactly this way, the basic concept can be widely applicable when generalized to be one of expanding returns, which are actually ubiquitous on the album. An earlier moment in Layer Ghosts to Rest provides a relatively straightforward example. Here, the C section is repeated an extra time when it returns. Extremophile Elite shows that expanding returns need not happen as part of a static variable construction at all. The distinctive guitar pull-off motive is expanded with each subsequent appearance throughout the course of the song. This is still an instance of an expanding return, even though the motive is embedded in different riffs and sections. It stands out in different contexts because of its unique sound. Finally, several of the song-length section returns feature this exact type of horizontal expansion. Listening with an ear for these expanding returns can lead to a dynamic, goal-oriented hearing of many of the otherwise cyclical recapitulatory moments. In this paper, I've discussed the ubiquity of motivic returns in Parallax 2 and developed the concepts of static variable parts constructions and expanding returns to describe how motivic returns tend to follow specific patterns. Part of my work has been taxonomical. I'm doing the time-honored music theoretical activity of giving names to patterns that I find in music. However, my larger argument has been that each of these types of return plays a more or less concrete role in fan experience. On the more concrete side, song-length section returns provide formal signposts for listeners and contribute to the metaphor of song as journey. Fleeting and subtle album-length motivic returns function to reward the close engagement with which many fans interact with this album. On the more abstract side, the frequency of appearance of static variable constructions and expanding returns can form the basis for syntactical structural hearing. Instead of listening for a structural dominant and its eventual resolution, as happens in traditional construals of syntactic listening in tonal harmony, I hear in this music a drive towards cyclical and additive structures based on motivic return. What arises is the same, a sense that what I hear is linked in a meaningful way to some part of what has come before and will be linked to what comes after. And I hope from that I've begun to demonstrate an alternative way of thinking about the compelling sense of momentum that progressive metal can so effectively create. Thank you for watching.
Was I ever